Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about the many different kinds of hydrothermal habitats. Previously we talked about hydrothermal systems and their discovery and how they were important biological discovery as well as an important geological discovery. And today, and also how the heat source and the energy source for hydrothermal systems is the magma that comes from the Earth's mantle, rises up to the surface at mid-ocean spreading centers, and that warms up water circulating from seawater through the oceanic crust, and that hot water forms a hydrothermal circulation system that creates the chimneys that we saw last time. And we talked about these weird and wonderful animals that live very close to the source of the hydrothermal fluids venting out of these chimneys, and the many different kinds of animals and their bacterial endosymbionts and ectosymbionts. So today I want to talk about the many other kinds of habitats in hydrothermal systems where microbes live, in addition to the animals, because the endosymbionts and the ectosymbionts of animals are only a tiny, tiny proportion of all of the microbes who live in hydrothermal systems. So today we're going to talk about all of the other places where microbes live in hydrothermal systems. And this diagram is going to serve as our outline. So first of all, let's talk a little bit more about the chimneys themselves. Last time we talked about how the water that is venting from the chimneys carries all kinds of energy and chemicals that chemoautotrophic organisms can use for their metabolism and to fix carbon dioxide to make their own food. But the chimneys themselves that are formed by the venting of these hydrothermal fluids are also important to talk about. They provide habitats for the microbes and also provide minerals and nutrients and energy sources that microbes can eat. So first of all, the chimneys are formed when the super hot water meets cold seawater, and that mixture of hot and cold water, and the hot and cold waters have very different chemistries, that mixture results in the precipitation of these minerals and metals that forms these chimneys. The chimneys are, in fact, made out of metals. Many of the minerals forming these chimneys are composed of copper and nickel, iron, manganese, and in general, many of the minerals are some combination of a metal and sulfur, so they're often called metal sulfide chimneys. And they are, in fact, as heavy as metals. These are very heavy structures as well as very large structures. Here is one sample that was collected from the top of one of these structures. And notice this scale bar is 1.5 meters, and this scale bar is 13 meters. So these are building-sized structures that are formed at mid-ocean spreading ridges. This is a micrograph showing how there are microbial biofilms living inside the chimney structures themselves. That's because even though these are made out of metal, they're actually quite porous, especially at high temperature. There are many cracks, and the minerals themselves are porous, that is, water can flow through them, and that provides a lot of surface area where biofilms can form and microbes can live. In addition to living inside the chimneys and the chimney minerals and metals providing a good habitat and things to eat, the chimneys are very heterogeneous. And that is again because of this mixture of super hot hydrothermal fluid and very cold deep seawater. And this gradient is not only a temperature gradient, but it's also associated with a chemical gradient, such that the hydrothermal fluids are bringing energy-rich chemicals like hydrogen gas and iron and sulfur, and seawater is bringing electron acceptors like oxygen and nitrate and sulfate. And the mixture of those things, lots of electron donors, lots of electron acceptors, creates this very rich, not only one habitat, but a very rich set of many different habitats. So that if you're an organism who likes to live at a nice, warm, like bath-like lukewarm temperature, you can find that Goldilocks zone somewhere around here. If you like to live at super hot temperatures, you can live at that kind of temperature too. No life can live at 350 degrees Celsius. That's just crazy hot. But again, that 350 degrees Celsius cools down to something that is livable, something around 100 degrees Celsius very, very quickly. It even cools down to something like 10 degrees or even 2 degrees very quickly. So if you're an organism who likes to live at cold temperatures, you can also find that habitat on a hydrothermal chimney just a few centimeters away from where the super hot temperature water is venting. So basically any temperature, any metabolism, any chemical reaction you can find in a hydrothermal chimney within a few centimeters of each other. They're extremely rich ecosystems. Okay, that was our first type of habitat, which are these hot chimneys themselves. The second habitat we want to talk about are the old inactive chimneys. So as the oceanic crust spreads and moves away from the spreading center, the chimneys lose their heat source. Their plumbing goes away, and they no longer have hot water flowing through them. But just like a dead tree, a dead chimney is not really dead. It just becomes a different kind of habitat, in the same way that a tree that falls down in the forest then becomes a habitat for many other kinds of organisms. So here are images of a dead, or at least an inactive chimney, a chimney that is no longer venting hot water. These pictures are showing the many different kinds of minerals that you can find in these wonderfully heterogeneous and variable habitats. And this is a cool paper that looked at the microbial communities living in these inactive chimneys. And for now, all we want to mention about this figure from that paper is that these communities are quite diverse. There are many different groups of organisms that live in these inactive chimneys, even though they no longer have hot water flowing through them. And different kinds of inactive chimneys have different kinds of microbes. So they're still rich and diverse and variable ecosystems, even though the hot water is no longer flowing through the chimney. All right, that was number 2. Moving along to number 3 is the plumes that are emitted from the chimneys. So in this diagram, you see this green kind of fog emanating from the source of the hydrothermal fluid. And that kind of fog, or actually a smog would not be a bad analogy, is also another important habitat. So here's a figure going into this in more detail. Here's your hydrothermal chimney. Here's the magma source driving the hydrothermal circulation. And as the water vents out of the chimneys, it mixes with the seawater. And if there's vigorous enough venting, and there often is, that hydrothermal fluid can actually be injected into the water column, into the rest of the ocean, at a significant depth above the chimneys themselves, which is what's being drawn here. And you can actually get a recirculation system going where then the denser water now sinks and becomes entrapped again in the hydrothermal system, and you can have a little circulation current like this. So as we know now, these hydrothermal fluids contain lots of yummy chemicals for microbes like hydrogen gas and hydrogen sulfide and methane, and it also contains elevated concentrations of metals like iron and manganese, which are often limiting in the ocean. So this is an injection of lots of really good stuff for microbes, and there have been many studies to show that this stimulates biological activity in the ocean. So what would otherwise be normal, boring seawater at a random spot in the ocean actually has additional biological activity because it is being influenced by this hydrothermal source. And so you actually get a spike in autotrophic activity, that is carbon fixation and primary production in the deep ocean, far below where you would get sunlight-powered primary production because of chemicals being injected into the ocean from hydrothermal systems. All right, that was habitat number 3. Habitat number 4 are hydrothermal sediments. I only have this one slide about sediments because I don't want to go into too much detail right now, but just to say what that means is that often you get minerals precipitating out of the plume, which is what this red arrow is showing here. So we have this plume that we were just talking about, and as that plume mixes with seawater, the temperature cools down, and as you might have seen in a chemistry class before, if you have hot water with lots of stuff dissolved into it, and then you cool that water down, a lot of that stuff will precipitate out, especially things like metals that are only soluble at high temperatures. So they fall out of solution and will actually literally fall down to the ground and form a coating of hydrothermal sediments kind of as an apron around a hydrothermal chimney field. And these sediments forming and falling on the seafloor will then create their own type of microbial habitat. And there are particular communities that live in these sediments that fall as aprons around the chimneys. You also get sediments by just erosion of the chimneys themselves. If the chimneys get too big, they literally just fall over. When the heat source goes away and they become inactive, then they start to slowly degrade and crumble, and that's another source of these sediments, which again forms a distinct habitat on the seafloor that is very different than if those sediments were not there at all. And again, they're associated with additional biological activity. All right, hydrothermal sediments was our habitat number 4. Now habitat number 5 is the oceanic crust itself. So the oceanic crust is the bedrock of the seafloor, drawn in this grayish color in this diagram. And the point we want to make with this is that most, or at least 50% of the seafloor, 50% of the oceanic crust is host to significant amounts of hydrothermal circulation, which is to say the hydrothermal circulation is not limited to just this one spot where the super hot water rises and exits from the chimneys, but a hydrothermal circulation refers to the fact that much of the ocean itself is constantly circulating through the oceanic crust. And this diagram explains that in a little bit more detail. So here again is our magma chamber. This is where the heat source from the Earth's mantle is. This is where most of the heat is rising and making the superhot fluids vent through the chimneys here. But this is only the most concentrated version of the hydrothermal circulation, and that this heat source also drives hydrothermal circulation through much of the oceanic crust, which is being drawn here. And to explain what these different kinds of rocks are shown in this diagram, these are the sheeted dikes. So these are volcanic rocks that are formed in the subsurface. Extrusives are basically lava that has cooled on the seafloor. So these are like basalts, or pillow basalts, which is why they're drawn like little pillows. And these have different porosities. So water can flow through pillow basalts, these extrusive volcanic rocks on the seafloor, much more easily than it can through these sheeted dikes, which are very impermeable. And so water circulation tends to be concentrated in this upper layer of the crust. And there are places in the ocean where water is sucked into the rocks. So this is where seawater enters the hydrothermal circulation system. And water can exit these chimneys, of course, as we've already seen in dramatic ways. But seawater also exits the hydrothermal system in random spots in the ocean where bedrock emerges from a sediment layer, for example. And again, this type of hydrothermal circulation, which is not hot, it is often very difficult to detect this type of hydrothermal circulation because the temperature difference of this water, for example, coming out of a place like this and the surrounding seawater can be 1 degree Celsius, or maybe even less than 1 degree Celsius. There are also places where it's quite warm, like you can find 20 degrees Celsius water coming out of bedrock like this, but often it's very, very minor, but enough that it is in fact driving hydrothermal circulation. And the water down here can be warm, it can be cold, it can be everything in between. And again, about 50% of the seafloor is host to some kind of hydrothermal circulation like this. From a biological perspective, we knew that the subsurface was an important habitat because of experiments like this. So here's a paper from 2001. This was in the lab where I did my PhD, but just before I joined the lab, when I read this paper as an undergraduate, it was one of the things that really got me excited about hydrothermal biology in the first place. So this paper has an important place in my heart. So to explain this paper to you very briefly, they found one of these places, like on the previous figure, where water was coming out of the subsurface and the water was warm. So here it's shown that what they call diffuse upflow was between 5 and 30 degrees Celsius. So it was like lukewarm water. It was some distance away from a super hot hydrothermal zone. And the geologist thought, like we saw in the previous figure, that there was some kind of circulation system like this that was cooling this water down, but it was still hot enough to come venting out of the bedrock. And so they took samples of this lukewarm water, took it into the lab, and used the same methods that they used to culture hyperthermophiles for much hotter habitats. And with these methods, they made this tree, which we don't really need to look at. The important thing is that they had 13 different strains within the same genus of Thermococcus, which is a genus of hyperthermophilic bacteria. And all 13 strains that they cultured from fluids that were 12 to 14 degrees Celsius, so in this range of 5 to 30, all of them preferred to grow at greater than 80 degrees Celsius. So when they grew them in the lab, they grew fastest at temperatures above 80 degrees Celsius, even though they were collected from fluids that were only 12 to 14 degrees Celsius. So what does that imply to you? That they actually prefer to grow at a temperature that is much hotter than the temperature of the water that they were sampled in. Well, in this paper, the reason why this was a very influential paper is that they convincingly argued that this meant that there was a habitat in the shallow subsurface in the oceanic crust that was quite hot, more than 80 degrees Celsius, where these organisms like to live, and that the water cooled down before the scientists were able to sample it on the surface. So this one simple observation of hyperthermophiles in relatively warm but not super hot fluids predicted the existence of a subsurface habitat, which now we have many more studies confirming the presence of, but this was an important initial observation. Another interesting thing that they noticed is that all of these hyperthermophilic bacteria that they collected were heterotrophic, meaning that they cannot fix their own carbon dioxide. They need to find food made by somebody else, which predicts that there must be primary producers. There must also be autotrophs in the subsurface, because where else are you going to make the organic matter that these heterotrophs need? Well, then a few years later, this same lab found those autotrophs. So in a very similar environmental setting, with lukewarm but not super hot samples, they found a hyperthermophilic methanogen, so an archaea that uses hydrogen gas and carbon dioxide to fix the carbon dioxide for its own food. It also fixes nitrogen, so it can get both of its carbon and nitrogen sources from nitrogen gas and carbon dioxide. And this confirms the prediction from the earlier study that there must be autotrophs in the same system if there are heterotrophs. So therefore, cool to warm fluids flowing from the oceanic crust are a window into a deeper, hotter zone of a very active and rich microbial ecosystem with autotrophs and heterotrophs and many other kinds of organisms as well. All right, so that was number 5, circulation through the crust. And the important point here is that much of the seafloor, even though it might look boring from the surface, in the subsurface, there's a deep, hot ecosystem of and very diverse and rich with autotrophs and heterotrophs and probably many different kinds of microbes. Okay, our last habitat that we're going to talk about today are subsurface aquifers. So this is related to the idea of circulation through the crust, but distinct, and this figure here explains that. So here's another figure. It's very similar to the ones we've been seeing. Here's an example where you have seawater being entrained into the bedrock, and it flows through the oceanic crust in some way, and then it vents in another spot on the bedrock. So here we're not even drawing any super hot hydrothermal chimneys. This is all low temperature hydrothermal circulation through the crust. And the previous study that I was talking about, by collecting samples from a place like this, they were able to predict that a subsurface habitat exists. And then that prompted many more studies where people actually directly accessed the subsurface habitat. And the way you do that is by drilling. So ocean drilling technology has been absolutely critical to making progress in this area. And here is an example of some of this technology. So these are corks. CORK stands for Circulation Obviation Retrofit Kit. So you can tell that they came up with the acronym and then tried to figure out what it stands for later. They inserted these corks in drill holes in a place where ocean circulation was thought to be flowing in a manner like this, where they thought they knew the direction of the flow, in this case as drawn from right to left, and they inserted multiple corks into the bedrock so that they could capture the water as it was flowing through this subsurface, subseafloor aquifer. So a place where water is flowing through lower porosity rocks because it is easier for the water to flow through these rocks than it is to flow through, for example, a very tightly packed package of sediment, which is what this brown thing is showing. So it's like an aquifer, just like an aquifer as you have in continents. In continents, aquifers are usually not just a big open space full of water. It's an aquifer, even in continents, is just a layer of rock that is a little bit more porous than surrounding rock. And that's the same thing that we're seeing here, is that these are rocks that are more porous than the surrounding rocks, and therefore the water flows through them and something like this. It was the prediction, and so they inserted these corks with sensors so they can measure the water as it's going past. The nice thing about these corks is that you can also insert experiments. So here is a set of colonization devices, so sterile minerals and other kinds of substrates that will capture microbes as they flow through the aquifer, and then the scientists can retrieve these experiments, bring them up to the lab to see what kinds of organisms were growing on their experiments, what they were eating, what they were making as waste products, and also just detecting what kinds of microbes are being transported in these subsea floor aquifers. Here is a lovely photo of someone checking out one of these corks on the seafloor. And there we go. Those are 6 different kinds of hydrothermal habitats. Once again, the main point here is that when we talk about hydrothermal microbial ecosystems, we're not just talking about the super hot water coming out of really tall chimneys. The chimneys are one important habitat, but also the plumes coming out of the chimneys are a distinct and important kind of habitat. When the chimneys get old and die and stop venting hot water, those inactive chimneys are still important habitats. The hydrothermal sediments that are precipitating out of the plume form another habitat. The oceanic crust is a habitat, and aquifers are a distinct component of that oceanic crustal habitat as well. And this is not only high temperature extremophilic organisms. Many places in the seafloor are host to seawater circulating through them at elevated temperatures and are influenced by the chemistry of the seafloor. And these are not extremophiles. They're just lukewarm, normal, boring bacteria that are benefiting from the chemistry and the energy of the subsurface of the Earth. All right, that is hydrothermal habitats. Thanks for listening. See you next time.